I am very excited to introduce our keynote panelist, Neeraj Mehta, who is the Director of Learning at the McKnight Foundation. He is going to be giving a lot of his introduction as part of his keynote, so I'm not going to spoil any of that for y'all. So Neeraj, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. We can take down the slides. I'm not going to have any slides at the beginning, and then I will pop some up later on. So just hold on. Let me get set up here. Okay. So I took a very long time to figure out like what it is that I wanted to focus on today. I knew right away that I did not want to talk about or pretend as if like I had any magical solutions to how we advance a more just, creative, and abundant future where people on planet thrive. I mean, I have ideas, but I don't want to stand up in front of you as if there are easy answers. And I know all of you don't think there are easy answers. Anyway, I also didn't want to stand in front of you and sort of list off a bunch of data about how much racial inequality exists in our region or lay out 400 years of exploitation, violence, and cultural imperialism. So instead, here's what we're going to do. I will tell you a little bit about myself, sort of justify why they invited me to be the speaker, lead us into a discussion around justice and what it requires from us. I'll talk about us and our relationship to each other and our roles in repairing past harms that contribute to stronger, more inclusive and thriving communities. And then I'll share a series of frames that I use in my own work to guide my thinking and action. And then we'll have time for question and answer at the end. And then also I'll just make a note that these ideas and thoughts are my own, and they don't necessarily represent the view of my employer or my family or my friends. These are my thoughts. So we'll go with it. And I can't wait to engage with y'all at the end with the questions you have. So just a little bit about me. My parents are from India. They got married, crossing significant lines of difference, caste, religion. They chose a love marriage instead of an arranged marriage. They landed in Minnesota in the 1960s, first in the Phillips neighborhood, and then to the northwest suburbs of St. Paul, New Brighton, and Arden Hills, where I was raised with my older sister in a very tight sort of immigrant enclave inside of a predominantly white community. I went to the University of Minnesota to study chemical engineering. In my sophomore year, in my first chemical engineering class, I got a 5 out of 100 on the first test, and I was like, this is not for me. I switched to civil engineering, and then my plan was to get a master's degree in architecture and then design and build bridges, which I never actually did, but I like to think I do that metaphorically through my work. Near the end of my time in college, which was in 1999, 2000, so 22 years ago, I moved into the Phillips neighborhood, East Phillips, just behind where Maria's Cafe is today, although back then it was a different, the makeup of the neighborhood was different. And I moved into a fourplex owned by PPL, which local folks know who they are. And in that fourplex, in that neighborhood, on that block, I started to build relationships with kids and families whose lives were really very different than mine. I learned about the realities of their lives as compared to mine and its intersections with housing, transportation, work, policing. It woke me up to the reality of injustice and popped my very middle-class bubble. And it was at that point that I knew I did not want to be a civil engineer. So when I graduated, I took a job running a youth program for PPL in the summer, which brought me to the North Side for the first time. And I fell in love. I've been living on the North Side now for 20 years. And I worked with families who were living in affordable housing scattered throughout the North Side. Simultaneously, I went to the Humphrey School and got my master's degree in public policy. Project for PPL stands for Project for Pride in Living, which is a nonprofit community development organization in the Twin Cities. After I graduated from the Humphrey, I helped start a small nonprofit on the North Side, which I did for a few years. And then I left that work to go work at Nexus Community Partners in 2008. I went to the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs in 2012. And then I landed at McKnight as their inaugural Director of Learning in 2018. So I say all that just to say that like my work has spanned everything from like social service, urban planning, community development, research justice, community organizing, and now philanthropy. And so I bring sort of a mix of all of that to the way I guess I think about the work and the issues that we care about. So when I started working in community development in the 2000s, I had very little understanding about race and how it fundamentally shaped life and the worlds around me. Most of the work I was involved in was happening in a sort of insular theoretical universe, wholly detached from considerations of race. I mean, yes, there was an acknowledgement of racism, but issues of race more deeply felt hidden to me. I learned a timeline of policies and practices that produced racialized impacts, historic and current, but I had very little understanding about how race really worked. Nor did I fully understand the centrality of white supremacy, I think, in planning and community development theory and practice. It took me years to sort of recognize, as my friend Dr. Rashad Williams writes in an article, that from the beginning, the American planning tradition developed within the context of settler colonialism, slavery, and Black Code laws, and operated under Jim Crow, separate and unequal, white hysteria, and colorblind racism. From the outset, he goes on to say, planning has not been characterized by an inclusivist urban conversation, but an exclusive white conversation. And again, it took me forever to put all the pieces together about how the policies and practices of racial and exclusionary zoning, racial covenants, restrictive deeds, redlining, racially motivated referendums against public housing were all done focused on white interest, which to me is different than understanding racialized impacts. Understanding white interest and the way we invest in it politically, culturally, socially, economically was a very steep learning curve for me. And what was the consequence? I think I neglected the role whiteness played in shaping urban outcomes. I might have understood conditions across, say, neighborhoods in Minneapolis as unjust and unfair. I might have been able to describe how racial inequities exist everywhere. And I became very good at describing how bad it was for communities of color and why, and being able to share a long timeline of injustice in our country. But I lacked the ability to really see whiteness and white affluence and the way it shows up in our cities and neighborhoods, and of course, how it shows up in planning and community development, academia, and philanthropy. In a strange way, I think we actually have to center whiteness more, including the way in which we understand how we invest in it historically, and then over and over and over and over again today. So we can't ignore it. That's what I mean by centering it, not that we feed it. Two things that I believe deeply today. Any conversation about equitable development must also include analysis, discussion, and challenging of white advantage and all the ways we produce it, preserve it, and pander to it, and that there is no cost-free escape from a history of harm spanning generations. Another consequence, I think, early in my career from the lack of learning and exposure I had was that I operated with a very, I think, immature understanding of justice, including what justice requires and how we individually and collectively should respond to it, to respond to injustice. I think in many ways I approached my work accepting the background structure of society as given and fixed, and instead focused on alleviating the burdens of those most disadvantaged by our current arrangements. This meant leaving the rules of the game untouched and instead focusing on helping players win at a broken game. I problematized communities of color rather than the systems of injustice that produced the outcomes we see today. I operated with a sort of uninterrupted or under-interrogated status quo bias that saw communities as victims and passive beneficiaries of our good action versus powerful actors capable and interested in defining their own destinies. I worked on solutions that strive to take the world as it is and make it a little bit better, but didn't focus as much on transforming the way the world works. And so there's three main principles that have guided scholarly work on justice, and they focus on things like equal distribution of materials, valuing different identities, and increasing participation in all things from democracy to planning, etc. And I guess in some ways, like my work has touched on all of these principles in some form or fashion, including a lot of work helping to increase participation, community engagement, and representation of communities of color in decision-making spaces, as well as work that strives to prevent the stigmatization and dehumanization of communities of color. I feel good about all that work, but I'm more clear today that operating within just these three principles is not enough. Again, and that makes sense because the three main principles came from early scholars on justice who had very little to say about race and how it fundamentally shaped the life and world within which they lived, and its impacts on the very objects they studied, like the state, justice, capitalism, democracy, or power, which again was a lot like me, I think, in my early career. So if those principles aren't enough, what principles are missing in our definition of justice, and how does it guide us in our reparative planning work? So I'll jump to the work of Dr. Danielle Allen, and her work lives at the intersection of political philosophy, ethics, and public policy. And she says that a necessary component to advancing racial and economic justice is political equality. And she defines political equality as being made up of 5 principles: freedom from domination, which means that you're free from arbitrary interference, pathways that allow equal access for all of us to pull on the levers of power, commitment to cultivating knowledge that strengthens collective decision-making by drawing on the knowledge of the source of all of us, not just some of us, co-creation and co-ownership of political institutions, and reciprocity, or mutual sort of relational responsiveness. That's a lot of principles there. I just want to focus on the first one, which she calls difference without domination. And she also says, just FYI, that a world without domination is not a world without hierarchy or a world without constraints, but that the hierarchy and the constraints, such as laws, are legitimate. So freedom from domination, she goes on to say, is more than just protection from that arbitrary interference. It also requires equal share of control over the institutions, the laws, the policies, procedures that interfere with folks' lives. Justice, she says, cannot exist without people having greater control over their choices and lives and being freed from control that comes from a history of domination from an elite few. And of course, I think all of us know that giving up control is hard, especially when we work inside of technocratic systems that have decided who is the expert, who knows best, who can be trusted, who is competent, and who is not. In a technocratic approach to planning or community development, we've relegated communities themselves to beneficiaries of our wise action versus powerful, competent, trustworthy actors able to design and shape their own communities and futures. We ask communities to get behind us versus us choosing to get behind them. So when we're having conversations about equitable development, we're also having conversations about justice. And when we're having conversations about justice, we're also having conversations about non-domination and control. And when we're having conversations about non-domination and control, we're also having conversations about power. And power concedes nothing. And so much power in our society is held by so few. So many of our institutions and systems are controlled by a small group of people having power over a larger group of people without any real accountability to those people. Urban planning, community development, academia, philanthropy, everything, every sector I've worked in, all of these spaces are experts at the idea of practicing elite capture. So what are the consequences of elite capture? Georgetown professor Olafumi Taiwo wrote a book about this very concept titled Elite Capture. And here's what he said. He talked about 3 consequences. One is, of course, unfair distribution of resources. And so he says those with greater access to power by virtue of their lineage or caste or economic wealth or gender or some other reason have the ability to influence the transfer of funds, resources disproportionately. Public goods and resources such as knowledge, attention, and values are unfairly distributed just as much as material wealth and political power are. He goes on to say, more precisely, the distribution patterns of all of these are distorted in similar ways for similar reasons, and that elite capture is symptomatic of social systems with unequal balances of power. The second consequence he talks about is distraction or narrow focus. And he says that this is a consequence in the way in which the smaller group, elites, influences the larger groups, you and me, to focus narrowly, usually still in the interests of the elites and distracting from where focused attention might actually draw more transformative reforms. And the third consequence that Taiwo notes is what I would call being good roommates versus building a new house. And what does that mean? So here we are, 98 of us, it looks like, in a room, right? Similar rooms like ours exist throughout the year in different places. And in some ways, we're like roommates working on this social project of advancing equitable development. We're all good people, well-intentioned, working hard. It's just us. And so here we are to discuss equitable development. We're learning to practice deference, right? Ensuring that all of our diverse voices are heard and that we are recognizing and appreciating the knowledge and power that each of us have, which is a principle of justice I noted earlier. Some of us might defer the privileges that come with positional power or educational background or gender or race, making space and stepping back as good partners and allies. Deference is good. I'm not saying that, right? And we're learning in this room, and we'll learn throughout the day how to work together to advance common goals around equitable development. That principle I talked about of co-creation does live in this room. At the same time, I would argue that this room is totally rigged. I was telling you how I think this conversation might be rigged, right? And that it's a great conversation that we'll be having today. But again, is it the conversation we should be having, and who decided? So you get what I'm saying. Other people tell us what conversations we can have, which ones we cannot in mixed groups like this. It's kind of a game, and we're players just trying to play it within the rules someone else wrote for us, trying to make the best of it. Our room is just one room in a house full of rooms, a house built by someone else on a foundation of values and principles like racial capitalism, extractive economics, and a society that values and deploys resources more to those who are white than others. This is a room that history has built for us. And my question is, do we really want to live here? Do we want to do our work in this room? Who decided this was the question we should be discussing today? I mean, okay, we did, and I shout out to the planning group, right? It's a good question, but I'm pushing us to try to wrestle with the idea that it's possible we set our sights too low on the types of questions we need to ask in order to truly advance equitable development. Is it possible that the questions we start with limit our ability to advance truly transformative change and solutions, and to truly exercise the power that a group like us working together actually has? What if, rather than the framing the conversation on how can development repair past harms and contribute to a stronger, more inclusive and thriving community, what if the conversation was framed around how do we stop global capital and the profiteering interests of predatory developers and predatory landlords and the political and business elites that support them from building a Twin Cities where only some of us can afford to live, be safe, and benefit from the social, environmental, and economic assets of our region? We're not allowed to have that conversation in this room, right? I mean, I just can't see that framing making it out of the planning meeting. It's too big, it's too controversial, it's unrealistic, it's triggering, it's not helpful, it's polarizing. Instead, here we are in this room trying to be better roommates, which is not bad, don't hear me wrong, right? If we only focus on changing the norms of our interactions locally and cosmetically elevating the voices and perspectives in this room, the harder it becomes to change the conversation in the house. So when and where are we building our own rooms or our own houses? And when or where are we learning how to be together in those spaces with an eye on the upstream power we need to build and to achieve the transformation we really desire and know we need? Why can't we be the developers, the builders, the architects, the bankers of our preferred future? Is it possible we've set our sights too low? Is it possible we're afraid to really explore what our power is and to activate it through a multiracial coalition of diverse people, practitioners, planners, community members, and everyday average people? Government, I would argue, is actually incapable of securing just or fair outcomes for our citizens because so many of the biggest disadvantages communities face are imposed externally and at a meta level, which does not mean the instruments of government aren't useful. It's just not enough. We have to be clear about what problem we're trying to solve and how to use the tools we have to do new, more bold, and more powerful things. And the other thing I would wonder is what if even a focus on equity is too small? What if we accidentally have narrowly understand advancing equity as fixing or repairing things that happened in the past? And what if instead we use the planning and development frame, like Dr. Williams that I quoted earlier articulates, that is rooted in a hopeful future that tackles the issues of climate change and racial and economic justice head on, centered on expanded principles of justice like non-domination, co-creation, and reciprocity? What if we saw this approach to planning and development as a future-oriented project, which is something Dr. Taiwo talks about, engaged in a better social order, and that the costs of building this more equitable world were distributed more to the elites who have inherited the economic benefits of past injustices, rather than nickel and diming our way to justice? Okay, that was a lot, and we went through 2 pauses with the internet. So I'm gonna make a switch into like, even within that context, there's of course lots of good work that we can do. And so Hannah, now I think I'll have you work through the slides here. If you can go to the Our Moment slide. And there are slides. These slides can be made available to folks after we're done. And the first 10 or 12 slides have a lot of the content that I just went through. So you'll have access to that. And then Hannah, let's see if you can keep up with the way I'm going. I think it should be pretty self-explanatory. So, okay, so our moment. We're in a watershed moment driven by health and economic emergencies, widespread reckoning on racial justice, growing political polarization, and challenges to democracy and the acceleration of climate change. The dramatic scale and fast pace of this period means that change is constant, unpredictable, and moves faster than ever before. So while challenging in many ways, this paradigm shifting moment is also ripe with opportunities for us to reimagine the ways we understand the world around us and our relationship to it. So now I'm going to go through a series of frames again that I use to navigate my own thinking and action, sort of an offering, and hopefully they'll be useful to you as well. So this is the first one, which is good governance theory. And you can read about this in the book Civic Power. And this theory has 3 hypotheses that a lot of folks rely on as paths to reform and transformation. So the first one is about civility, which believes that we fail to make change because we fight too much. We have increased rancor and partisanship, and therefore the solution is to be increasing good faith dialogue, common sense, and use that to supplant division, gridlock, or conflict. The second one is the transparency hypothesis, which says by making public and private sector action more visible and subject to public opinion, we can improve the responsiveness and accountability. And then the third one is about rationality, that says the central problem is that public and private sector actors lack the expertise, information, and apolitical decision-making needed to serve the public good. And so this theory, this hypothesis then pursues remedies that are about increasing use of data, technocratic expertise, insulation from politics, and trying to depoliticize various bodies and actors. So I'm sure we can all give examples of what each of these have looked like in action or how we ourselves have tried to use them. The fundamental problem, though, with the good governance theory is that it rejects the value and importance of political disagreement and contestation. The approach arises in part from relatively elite reformers from privileged backgrounds who tend to downplay problems of race, gender, religion, class, power, which makes current attempts at reform often quite problematic. It's doubly made difficult by the fact that so many of our institutions are not representative, reflective, or responsive to most individuals and communities. The reality is that disparities in racial justice, safety, and economic well-being are deeply intertwined with disparities of political power. The deep alienation of communities of color from formal systems of policymaking help drive the persistence of policies with racially disparate impacts, from criminal justice reform to economic policy or even equitable development. Therefore, any serious pursuit of equity, inclusion, or justice cannot be achieved without first building the political power of those communities on the ground. The solution is not good governance, but countervailing power. Okay, so that's one frame. Now we'll go to the next one. This is called the Three Horizons Framework, which describes the patterns or ways of doing things and how their prevalence and interactions evolve over time. You can stay back on the chart, Hannah. There you go. The change from the established pattern of the world as it is to the emergence of new patterns as it could be. So it looks like the decline of business as usual, which is the red line, towards a more equitable, regenerative rise of a more viable future, which is the green line. The first horizon, red, represents our current systems, many of which are beginning to show symptoms of decline and shortening cycles of crisis and temporary but never full recovery. It's business as usual and it does not fit, and we can all give examples of that. The green line, horizon 3, is how we envision an alternative or more preferred future. We may not be able to define it fully because it's always uncertain, yet we know fundamental transformations from the red system are necessary. Horizon 2 is the blue line, which represents the world in transition. And this is sort of the entrepreneurial and culturally creative space that disrupts business as usual. So our work is to see and seed the alternative preferred future we know we need and innovate and disrupt business as usual so that we can transition to something more viable quicker. And then inside of that, there are choices around what kind of leader we can be. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. So the H1 perspective, which is the status quo, can be compared to the role of the manager, responsible for keeping the lights on and the business operational without massive disruption to its basic functioning, which isn't inherently bad. You can't just go from old world to new world by just turning a light switch, right? So there's the role of the manager. The H2 perspective, which is the vat of the entrepreneur, who sees the potential advantage of doing things differently, challenging the status quo in operational ways, but sometimes can get stuck because it doesn't question the cultural narrative that maintains business as usual or status quo. So H2 leaders can go either way. They can use disruption to reinforce the existing system, or they can use disruption to transform it. And then the last one is the perspective of the visionary, which calls for profound transformation towards a better, more just, fair, equitable, thriving, and sustainable world. So we have choices, and sometimes we play all three. So the next framework, this is on systems change, right? So as we pay attention to all three horizons, we also have to direct our work to 3 levels of systems change. At the top is the structural change level, which focuses on change like public policies, practices, and how resources flow. We spend a lot of time here traditionally. The second layer is where relational change happens. And this is a focus on power and shifting relationships. And then the deeper level is about transformative change, which is where we change beliefs, narratives, or worldviews. So systems change requires working at all 3 of those levels, right? It takes changing the narratives, the rules, the investments, the relationships, and power structures we operate within. Each level is interdependent on the other. For example, a change in a mental model might lead a policymaker to understand an issue differently and propose a new policy leading to more structural transformation. My main point here is that I think we get stuck at only focusing on the top because we define every problem as a policy problem. But unfortunately, not everything is a policy problem. If we're going to make real progress on bold climate solutions, equitable development, or racial justice, then we're going to have to grapple with the reality that not every solution starts as a structural solution. Although it's tempting to start by looking at technical fixes like changing policies, implementing new tech, or sharing information, the things that we can most easily grasp, often the toughest problems we aim to address will require us to confront power dynamics and cultural shifts. So you can go to the next slide. Political science, Hari Han, this is an infographic that she has. Again, it's a lot, but you'll focus on the green bubble there in the middle. She notes that some of the most powerful changes occur when there's an alignment between a person's motivation to act and their authority to act. Power problems occur when there's a misalignment between motivation and authority. Either those who have the motivation to make change lack the authority or capacity to act, or those who have the authority lack the motivation. Solving problems of power then requires bringing motivation and authority into alignment. Therefore, any serious pursuit of equity, inclusion, and justice cannot be achieved without first building the power of communities on the ground and then working to make cultural shifts that support those power shifts with those who might have authority but are less motivated. Okay, our next and almost last frame. So as we discern the roles we play across the horizons, through the three levels, we're also going to confront a variety of choices about how we act to contribute to equitable and durable systems change. This is often described as complicated versus complex distinction. So complicated is on the left. These are more predictable and controllable. Complicated problems often have defined solutions. They can be fixed and their progress can be measured in the short term. Complex problems are on the right. They're harder to control and often constantly evolving. Complex problems regularly require shifting to circumstances and changes in the landscape. They can be healed, but often not fixed, and sometimes progress takes decades. This is a very oversimplification. There's a continuum between complicated and complex, but my main point is that as we go about solving problems, we might be playing across this continuum, and we have to have sort of the ability to define and understand what we're doing and why. Okay, and then the last thing is that like we have to change our own systems. So any place that any of us work, our organization, our institution, et cetera, have the same dynamics that exist out in the world. So if we're trying to advance systems change in the world at all three levels within the three horizons along a continuum of clock cloud, then you likely have to do that at your institution as well. Shifting narratives, building new relationships, and transforming power, right? Making structural reforms in policies or resource flows. All of that happens close to home as much as it does out in the world. And then finally, I'm just going to end with this idea that we have different roles that we play. And I'm going to name 5 that we can play. And if you can go to the next slide. Actually, yeah, okay, keep going. I guess it builds. You can just do the whole slide. Yeah, there we go. So one more. Okay, so visionary. A visionary describes the world as it could or should be, not just as it is, uses abundant thinking, not zero-sum thinking, and tells stories that bridge us together, not break us apart. Visionaries challenge the status quo. The organizer and deal maker. This is a role where you align people's interests, strategies, money, and other resources towards solution-oriented action, build the motivation, capacity, and leadership that diverse actors need to act powerfully, and leverage your resources and those of others to accelerate change on big issues. Community builder. This is where you are proximate to multiple and different communities. You bring together leaders from communities to create tools, develop strategy, strengthen practice, and curate and disseminate knowledge amongst a broad group of people. Entrepreneur, we've talked about a little bit, but this is the role of leveraging your resources and reputation on new or untested ideas that have transformative potential. And then influencer, which is when you weave together all the new power, bridge relationships and networks that can span boundaries, and create platforms for collective action. So play those roles, I made a brief list of competencies that we need. There's probably more, but you need to know what role to play when. You have to have the ability to identify a problem and then act on it. Learn how to confront without conflict. Be skilled at shifting gears regularly. Operate with a whatever it takes orientation. Get comfortable with disagreement or tension. Lead with empathy and know how to disrupt people at a rate that they can handle. So to end, I'm just going to leave you with a quote uh, from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in 1965 was addressing the graduates of Oberlin College. And he said pointedly, there are all too many people who, in some great period of social change, fail to achieve the new mental outlooks that the new situation demands. There's nothing more tragic, he says, than to sleep through a revolution. And my encouragement to all of us is to not sleep on the revolution because it's here. Thank you.
So it looks like we've got a first question here for you. So Neeraj, what for you personally helped you adjust to disruption at a comfortable pace? Where are you a little scared to lean into transformative future, and what do you do to move through that fear?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think the definition of leadership that I use is disrupting people at a rate that they can handle, which I don't think is always about comfort. Um, I think that what helped me, I think grow this to be disrupted at a rate that I can handle is to constantly be putting myself in new and different places with new and different people. And I think I've had the luxury of that happening somewhat naturally. Um, but I think it's like getting out of my own bubble and my own tight social network that has really helped me do that. And that includes, forcing in my position where I spent years rooted in communities of color on the north side where I live, interacting at different levels of government or with predominantly white counterparts. That was part of my process also. Um, and so that's one part I think is just again putting yourself in new places with new relationships. And then where are you a little scared to lean into a transformative future? I think that when I was working on some of what I was talking about at the beginning, I think I fall into the trap of pragmatism. So even as I write and speak those words, I think I still fall into the trap of believing, well, that's too big of a question. That's too radical. That's unrealistic. That can't happen. So I accept the narrow question given to me and I say, well, let me just fix this because I think I know how. And I think really trying to push myself out of that into accepting the bigger question and organizing around the bigger questions, I think is probably I think I have work to do in that space.
Thanks for that, Neeraj. Um, we have another question in the chat here. And this may have been just kind of posing a general question, but I'm curious to get your take on it, Neeraj. If you have found a rate that specifically in Minnesota, given I think we have kind of a general unwillingness to be uncomfortable in Minnesota, and a kind of a culture of keeping a little bit of distance there, not being too personal with folks. As someone who is not from Minnesota, that was a pretty big shift coming from the South. Have you found a rate that white folks can handle when you're doing this work?
I mean, I try to avoid the like, white people are of course not a homogenous block. Um, is there a rate? I mean, I can't quantify it. I think it's all different. I think people are situated so differently. I could probably more likely speak to some of the traps that I think keep people stuck. And I think one of them is I alluded to it at the beginning, which is I do think there's a lot of people who believe you can repair a history of harm spanning generations with nickels and dimes or without sacrifice or loss. And I think getting people comfortable with this idea that there's a cost and maybe even a loss if you have been given generations of advantage. And even with that loss, I don't say that it makes you worse off per se, but that you do give up something. If even if it's like I said, control, power, etc. And I think that's one of the traps I see in a lot of our work is that, you know, we think that this is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is we think there's a cost-free escape. And I don't think there is.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I'm reflecting on from the government perspective, the way that we typically try to approach change, and really are looking for that cost-free approach. I'm wondering from so you're doing a lot of work in philanthropy right now. I'm wondering from your time working in a public institution, working with a lot of public policy folks, how have you seen shifts happening within that inverted triangle model that you had?
Yeah. You know, I think that like one narrative that has, I think maybe this is obvious to folks, is that the sort of climate crisis and our aim to solve and address racial and economic justice go hand in hand. And I think as a result of those intersections, you see new agendas being set and then new decisions being made. Not that we've made significant progress, but I do think that's a place where you're seeing some transformation in the narrative. So if we're going to talk about equitable development and housing and transportation, we're not going to be just talking about racial and economic justice. We're also going to be talking about the impacts of the climate crisis and how to resolve those. So that's probably one example. I think we have seen the transformation to a certain degree of this idea that engagement with those who are most impacted not only matters, but does lead to better solutions. I'm not saying that's by everyone, but I think that there's significant places where leaders in government or other places do recognize that and are trying to mobilize within the constraints of their position or power, et cetera. So that would be another one. And then I think, you know, the work organizers and communities of color did to decenter the narrative around problematizing communities of color through the way we use data or mapping, et cetera, and that places like the Met Council or other places are now also communicating the ways in which concentrations of white affluence also contribute as a problem, and that we have to interrogate the ways we resource whiteness in the same ways we underinvest where people of color are. And so I think that kind of narrative shift leads to other structural changes over time.
Hi, Neeraj. This is Victoria, the
Hey.
Legacy Family Center. I
Hey,
am
Victoria.
wondering, as just by listening to you, wondering how do you think the landscape of philanthropic organizations and foundations and those who give grants, whether it be cities, state, or counties, how do you think that they are thinking about changing that landscape of not just giving a little bit, but really working with communities so that they can be in the forefront of making, of changing the way Minnesota see its, well, so I'm an African, seeing its Black constituents, right? And as a person who runs a nonprofit organization, noticing that small nonprofit organization, those people always have to have a second job in order for them to continue to run the nonprofit, whereby they're the ones making the impact in the community, but finding funding is so difficult to come about. So what is your thinking on the changing landscape in Minnesota, and where do you think that is going?
And are you asking specifically within the philanthropic context?
Yes, yes.
I mean, just like a couple things. So like, you know, when I talked about the three horizons, which literally you can just Google Three Horizons framework and there's tons of great YouTube videos. I'm not claiming any unique knowledge here. But you know, philanthropic institutions like the one I work at are also needing to be transformed in those ways. And their house is built on a foundation of the very things that, you know, impact communities themselves: racial capitalism, extractive economics, whiteness. And so that's what I really mean. And I think that I try to embody in the like change your own system piece, is that there's significant transformation undergoing and I think needs to happen, but also wrestling with the tension that they're fundamentally built on systems of injustice. So while I think we make progress in a sort of incremental way. Though there are, you know, splashes where you see new things happening, they're still not at the scale that would be required. And even if I think we released, you know, whatever is held in philanthropic trusts, you know, I guess I would believe that like money isn't the only problem because of the values and the systems that undergird the way in which we value people. And so that's something that I think about a lot, which is the ways in which we have to shift those fundamental narratives and worldviews about who belongs and who's valuable, and then also do like all the things, right? So there's no like one way, I guess, is the way I would say it. But as it relates to philanthropy, I think there's improvements being made, but it's not fast enough and it's not full enough.
So we have a question. How do you suggest an H3 contends with an H1 who has been in power for decades and chooses not to challenge the status quo?
Oh, I mean, I know y'all are going in a break, but like, you know, I think so let me I wanted to actually talk about the H2 actually, and since you're from Austin, this might resonate because when I was studying up on the Three Horizons, somebody gave this example, which is like, let's talk about the H2, which is the entrepreneurial role. So the H3 is out there, an H3 leader is out there just casting a vision for an alternative preferred future. And I don't know how much the H1 pays attention or listens to the H3 or accepts it. An H2 leader who might be out there disrupting, what I was saying is that you can disrupt in a way that affirms the existing system, or you can disrupt in a way that really, you know, pushes it down. And the example I saw somebody use was actually like Uber, and this is where you'll have to tell me because you're in Austin, versus a company called Ride Austin. In Uber, right? Uber uses technology on an iPhone or, you know, a cell phone platform where you can, everybody knows how Uber works, right? But the fundamental premise way the business operates is extractive and exploitative, etc. But it's using a new technology to bring out innovation. What I heard about the story of Ride Austin is that Ride Austin used the same technology, but used a cooperative model of ownership with the drivers that created a positive impact on the innovation. So that to me, I think is important about how the H2 leader plays in the middle. And then again, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's the H3. I'd have to wrestle with it. I don't know if it's the H3 necessarily trying to influence the H1, or that we have allyship kind of in between. I'd have to wrestle with that a little bit more.